delightful to see you all here. My name is Ron Hassner. I'm a political science professor. I hold the Helen Diller Family Chair in Israel Studies, and I am a faculty co-director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, which is hosting this event. We are supported entirely by philanthropic sources. Our goal is to provide a rich academic forum for our nation's future leaders to explore the breadth and complexity of Israel and contemporary Jewish issues, especially at a time like this when polarization is more severe than ever. We work to bring integrity, excellence, and grit to fostering a dynamic space where students and the wider community can engage thoughtfully and exchange ideas about Israel. And our guest at tonight's event is Amichai Magen. I'll read you a brief summary of his resume in a minute. He's come to us from Stanford University, and you might wonder, why would we honor a professor from Stanford University at our august forum? So the answer is that this Israel Institute here at Berkeley played a small part in helping our colleagues at Stanford sort of set and initiate their Israel work. And so we are actually absolutely delighted that there is now energy in Israel studies on the Stanford campus. And Professor Amichai Magen is the best symbol of that energy and that future potential. He is the inaugural visiting fellow in Israel studies at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, and a visiting professor in the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, also at Stanford. He is the director of the program on democratic resilience and development at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy at Reichman University, which some of you may know formally as IDC Herzliya. It's Israel's first private university in Herzliya on the beach. And currently at Stanford University. Thank you for visiting us. Thank you for talking to us about Israel and the global crisis of liberalism. Amichai is going to talk for 5, 10 minutes, 15, 20, 30 minutes, 35, 45 minutes. And while he talks, some of our undergraduate fellows will be moving around the audience with little note cards that we would like you to write some questions on. And once Amichai is done talking, I will collate these questions and issue them to Amichai on your behalf. So Amichai, I'm now going to sit quietly and listen.
Yeah.
And you take it away. Thank you for coming.
I have some old friends here in the audience who are smiling at me, and looking forward to making some new friends. Before we jump into the talk, which I will try to keep as brief as possible, and I know that Ron will cut me off at the allotted time. I just want to acknowledge the fact that in literally 12 hours from now, 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War started. And it's very difficult for me to talk about the Yom Kippur War because it's intrinsically linked to my life. My mom was pregnant with me as my dad was fighting in Sinai. He was a tank commander who was pretty badly injured. And I grew up with the legacy of the Yom Kippur War throughout my childhood, and it's really affected my life and the generation of young men and women, now not so young, who were born after the Yom Kippur War. I remember in my class in a very small town in the Jezreel Valley, Kiryat Tivon, we had about 10,000 people, and in my class I had 40 kids, and 2 of the kids were born without fathers because they were pilots who died in the war. So this is very, very, I just wanted to acknowledge the momentous historical moment that we're about to experience. I also mention it because I think it has real resonance in a way, in a very different way, but real resonance for what we're living through today. You mentioned polarization. The Yom Kippur crisis wasn't just a military crisis, it was a crisis of trust. It was a crisis of confidence in the leadership. And Israel was never the same after the Yom Kippur War. There are some people who are making the analogy and who are talking about the last several months as a kind of a political Yom Kippur moment in Israel, and we may emerge a very different Israel from this period, for good and for bad, but always in unpredictable ways. So it very much relates to what I want to talk about today. I always like to pace around. I was born in the kibbutz. I'm used to, walking around, milking cows and doing things like that. So I will pace around a little bit. I essentially want to do four things today. Okay. If this was Stanford University, it would be 5 things. But because we're at Berkeley, we're going to keep things really simple. Okay. So I don't want to overwhelm you. So just 4 things. Okay. Not 5. I want to start. I'm going to spend most of my time actually talking about liberalism, and more specifically political liberalism, or what I like to call the liberal package. And I'm going to distinguish between the domestic and the international, because I think they're both incredibly important. And I'm also going to say something about how I see our existing liberal package, which is very much a post-Second World War, and in some respects a post-Cold War construction, how that package has come about, how it evolved, because I think that's really, really important for talking about the second thing that I want to talk about, which is the current global crisis of liberalism that we're experiencing, in which this package is really unraveling. And it's unraveling in the United States, and it's unraveling in Germany, and it's unraveling in Sweden, and it's unraveling in India, and it's unraveling in Israel. And in each of these places, it's unraveling in some respects in ways that we can recognize, right? That we say, hey, when I sort of look at the protests in Israel, when I look at the conflict between the executive and the Supreme Court, I can recognize something about my own democracy, whether I'm American or Indian or Brazilian, etc. But in many respects, the unraveling is unique, and it has local characteristics. The other thing to say about the unraveling is that we are living through it. And because we are living through it, we are surrounded by the fog of history, right? We are sort of, this is contemporary history. We'll only really be able to understand this, I think, in 20, 30, 50, 100 years' time. So we need to be equipped with historical humility and epistemological humility, because we're going through this. There's a lot of things that are happening, and we don't fully understand the unraveling of the liberal package. Okay, but it is happening all over the world. Okay. Then I want to just to set us up for conversation, because I want to reserve most of our time for conversation, in sort of pointing out a few points that I think will help us to try to sort of dig down and examine specifically Israel's kind of liberal crisis. Okay, I've never done this before. Completely experimental. Most of the news coverage that you've seen on what's been going on in Israel really focuses either on the protests or on Netanyahu's legal problems, or on the particular makeup of the current Netanyahu-led coalition government, the tensions between the Supreme Court and the executive, some of the legal cases that are coming before the Supreme Court, right? That's been most of the coverage, and I'm happy to talk about any one of these that you would like. But I think that there's a deeper story. I think there's a more fundamental transformation that is happening here. And in order to better understand where Israel may be going, in order to understand where democracy might be going in the future, we want to sort of tell that deeper story. Okay, so bear with me a little bit. This is going to get a little wonkish, a little, political theory kind of thing. But I know you can handle it. I'll lay this out as quickly as I can, and then we'll get to the juicy stuff about Israel. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, all right. So let's start with this. Okay, so what is the liberal package? As I mentioned, we can think about the liberal package as really dividing into 2 levels. We'll call it the domestic and the international, or what happens inside a democracy, and then what happens in the regional and global environment. Okay, and when we talk about the domestic liberal package, when we talk about the political dimensions of liberalism, we can think about liberalism as a package of values, institutions, processes that essentially combine 4 elements, okay? The state that concentrates and wields power, right? The famous definition of the state. What is the state? It's an organization that exercises a monopoly over the legitimate use of coercion, the legitimate use of force, right? You need to have a state in order to have a democratic state and a liberal order. Liberals are not anarchists. They believe that a state is necessary, right? So you have to have a state. Then you need to have democracy, by which I mean sort of a very kind of narrow sense of democracy. You need to have some kind of popular legitimation and accountability mechanism, right? In the modern era, in the liberal era, what gives a political order its legitimacy is it's not God, it's not the king, it's not charismatic leadership, it's the people, right? Government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? That's the idea. And what democracy does is to provide the regime with legitimacy, but also to prevent civil wars by providing a mechanism for peaceful transition of power. Okay? Very important. However, if you only have democracy in the state, you don't have a liberal democracy. For that, you also need the rule of law, which is a prohibition of abuse of power, especially by people who control the state or dominate the democracy. And the critical difference between the rule of law and rule by law is that under the rule of law, the law binds not only us, the people, right? It also binds the leaders, the people who would use coercive power on behalf of the state. So you have to have the rule of law. And lastly, and I think this is something that many times we've kind of missed and we haven't really paid very much attention to, this is what Aristotle called civic friendship. And when Aristotle spoke about civic friendship 2,500, 2,600 years ago, he didn't mean that like we would all, it wasn't like the Rodney King, can't we all just kind of get along type of thing. But the idea of civic friendship is that in order for a political system to operate successfully, we need to have a sense of belonging to a common community, right? Belonging to a common polity. That we might have profound disagreements with each other, but at the end of the day, we have a bond of citizenship, which is based on essential equality. So not Aristotle, but modern liberal notion of equality, and a kind of a shared narrative. Who are we? Who are we as a people? Where did we come from? What are we doing here together? Where might we be going? Right? That's the sort of Aristotelian idea of a civic friendship. Now, you would, in a healthy liberal democracy, these 4 elements are kind of in tune with one another and they balance each other out, right? If you need democracy and the rule of law to constrain the state, you need civic friendship to make sure that democracy doesn't become the tyranny of the majority, right? And you also need the rule of law for that, right? So each element kind of it sort of keeps the other in check. This is what we call sort of the liberal package. Okay, so that's the domestic, and in a moment, I think that just as this is fraying in the United States, right? When we talk about civic friendship in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, don't marry each other, and families are falling apart, etc. So I think there's also a crisis of civic friendship in Israel as well today, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I also want to mention that when we talk about the liberal package, it's not enough to talk about just the domestic, the internal. This is something that Americans don't typically think about because you're so big and powerful, you don't actually take the international system very seriously, right? But if you live in Poland or in Hungary or in Turkey or in Israel, the norms of the international system matter a lot, okay? I'm also going to say something about how Israel was born into this liberal international order and we've thrived under it and how that is changing at the moment as well, okay? But very, very briefly, when we think about the liberal package at the international level, we distinguish between what's called like a Westphalian layer and a Wilsonian or a liberal layer, and each has its own components. I won't belabor this. If anybody wants to pick up on this and unpack it a little bit later on, let me know, and I'll go back to the slide. Okay. So in the interest of time, I just want to mention that. Okay. How did this liberal package come together? And again, I'm not mentioning this only so out of historical interest. I think it's really critical to understand how the package came together so that we are better equipped to understand the current liberal crisis that we are living through, okay? So I want to suggest the following thing. I've written one article about this. This is going to probably become a book project. But I want to make an evolutionary argument about how liberal orders come together. Okay, so my argument is that liberal orders are actually subject to competitive selection, like Darwinian competitive selection. What do I mean by that? Political ideas and institutions that provide what I call superior or advantageous solution structures to the great challenges of the era that we're talking about. They contest with other type of ideas and institutions. And if they provide superior solution structures, over time elites select them and they are implemented in political systems, and then they also diffuse in the international system, right? We saw this in the 1990s with the defeat of Soviet communism, the end of the Cold War. Liberal democracy flowered all around the world. We went from a situation where in 1975, only about 27% of the countries in the world were democracies, to a situation where by 1995, it was like 60 or 62% of countries around the world, right? We had this global democratic boom. Why? Because liberal democracy became the only game in town. That was the model to adopt, right? It was sexy. You wanted to become rich, you would become a liberal democracy. You wanted to be militarily powerful, technologically powerful, you'd become a liberal democracy, right? All these things kind of went together. Liberal democracy provided these superior solution structures to what people wanted, okay? The point that I want to make is that we have to be very careful not to assume that liberal solutions will always be chosen. There's nothing, you and I may be quite enamored normatively with liberal democracy or liberal ideas in the classical English sense, right? I'm not saying progressive. I mean, it's sort of in the classical English sense of liberalism. But the point is that unless liberal states and societies are better able to answer the great challenge of their time, they may not necessarily be adopted, and they may not necessarily sort of win the competition over what kind of world we're going to have, right? This has a lot to do with what we political scientists like to call performance legitimacy, right? Democracy has to perform, it has to deliver so that people will adopt it, okay? Just to develop this idea a tiny bit more before we move on to the unraveling, I want to make 2 points. One is the world that we live in politically is very much a post-Second World War, and in many respects a post-Cold War world. Okay? Israel was born into this liberal international order, quite literally, right? 1948, right after the war, with the birth of the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF and NATO and all that infrastructure. And my argument is that actually our sort of liberal orders are the sort of cumulative ancestry of 3 sort of waves of order contestation where liberal ideas and institutions competed with anti-liberal or illiberal ideas, and they eventually won. They won in the sense that ultimately elites adopted those ideas, institutionalized them, and those ideas spread around the world because they were successful, okay? From the middle of the 17th century, people discovered that religious toleration was actually better than dogmatic religious war in terms of producing economic growth and well-being and welfare. And so initially the Dutch and then the English after the Glorious Revolution and more others, these waves take sometimes decades and centuries to really work themselves out. more and more people adopted the idea of that religious toleration was superior to religious dogma. And that is where modern human rights comes from. That's where civil and political rights come from, right? It's from the idea that toleration is better than religious persecution. Then in the late 17th, 18th, 19th century, countries that adopted limited government, right, with the rule of law and eventually democracy and federalism and all these things, eventually performed better than countries that lived under absolutist government. It took time, but eventually limited government outperformed absolutism, right? By the late 19th century, early 20th century, that was very, very clear. Britain was doing better. The United States was doing better than closed authoritarian countries and regimes. And then, of course, in the 20th century, market-based liberal democracy and this liberal international order outperformed totalitarianism, and we saw that in that it was the Allied powers that won the Second World War, and it was market-based liberal democracy that eventually won the Cold War, right? That's much more familiar. That's much more familiar to us. Okay, so in a way, the world that we're all born into and have been lucky enough to live into is a kind of triple distilled set of liberal wins that gave us the world that we live in. Okay, I think I'm doing all right time-wise. Okay, all right. Moving to the juicy stuff, the unraveling, right? This is the stuff that we're most interested in at the moment. We all have a sense that something in our democracies is not working right. Something in our social contract is not working right, and people all around the world believe that. Ron, you mentioned the term polarization. We now in the political science literature talk about toxic polarization, and we identify something like 40 countries around the world that are suffering such toxic polarization that democracy is really endangered in those countries, right? We see people taking extreme positions, very, very difficult to get bipartisan support for legislation, and just a general sense that that the system is not working, it's not delivering, it's not providing us with the things that we expect a good political order, what the ancient Greeks used to call eunomia, a good political order, what eunomia should provide, okay? I want to suggest that we're experiencing a kind of a liberal unraveling at the moment, which really we can think about it as happening in sort of three ways, okay? And again, I'll just lay this out and then we can revisit if you want. One is what we might call decoupling, and I already alluded to it, which is that these elements of liberal order, that when they work well together, they're sort of all in harmony with, these are decoupling from each other, right? So we see this in different ways in countries around the world. There are lots of countries where actually the thing that is really weak at the moment is the state. The state is simply not able to provide security or the kind of public goods that people expect in order to live decent lives. And when the state doesn't deliver, the rule of law gets shaky, democracy gets discredited, right? So the package sort of phrase that way. In other places, it's really that civic friendship that we were talking about that is sort of falling apart, and that is affecting democracy and the rule of law, and in some respects, the state. I also think, again, this is something that Americans don't think about too much, but again, smaller countries, including Israel, do think about this. There's a sort of a loss of international liberal embeddedness, right? Where countries were sort of used in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s to be embedded in an international system that kind of incentivized things like free trade and protection of human rights and things of that nature. And that embeddedness, that liberal embeddedness that was sort of led by the United States is much weaker today than it was even 10 or 15 years ago, okay? So we have a kind of like a decoupling. that magic circle, that balance is upset. But I think that there are two other things that are happening that are really relevant for Americans and for Israelis. One is we are living in a new era of order contestation. In the 1990s, we were all liberals. Even if you were conservative, you were a liberal, right? Even if you thought about yourself as a fascist, you were really a liberal, yeah? For all intents and purposes. Because it was the only game in town. I've made that point. That is no longer the case. Both in our domestic politics and internationally, we have new revisionist rivals who are explicitly anti-liberal. We see this, for example, in this new worship of Viktor Orban, right, as a sort of a representative. He calls himself a proud leader of illiberal democracies. He rejects liberalism as and not to mention Xi in China or Putin, right? So we have the rise of new ideas and powers that are challenging the existing order. They are providing what we sometimes called exit options, okay? So if in the 1990s, even if deep at heart I wasn't kind of committed to democracy, I had to play by the rules because everybody else was. But now I have choices. You know, I could sort of look at Erdogan, and I could look at Putin, and I could look at Xi, and I could look at Orban, and now I have choices, okay? And it creates new space for political entrepreneurs that identify an opportunity to gain power outside of the liberal consensus, right? And last but not least, just going back to how the package came together, we are all experiencing new evolutionary pressures. Liberals have become a little bit complacent, a little bit lazy, right? We thought in 1991 that the end of history had arrived. All we had to do was kick back, relax, you know, drink a margarita, and democracy, human rights, the rule of law were going to kind of like spread around the world by their own volition. We were kind of naive and sort of a little bit lazy. And what we've done is not only have we created space for anti-liberal elements to become stronger and authoritarian powers to become stronger, but we've also neglected coming up with liberal solutions to the great challenges of our era. How do we manage climate change? What do we do about social media? How do we regulate that? What do we do about AI? What do we do about synthetic biology? There are all these tremendous challenges that are making people very anxious. And when people are anxious, they tend to be less liberal. So we've entered a new age of anxiety with these new challenges, and we haven't really kept up. And we haven't really generated liberal solution structures to the great challenges of our era. Okay. I'm still doing okay for time, all right? But I'll speed this up, and we'll get to the conversation in a moment. Okay, so we are now living at an historical moment that, in many respects, I would call the liberalism schism, right? Liberalism hasn't evaporated completely. It hasn't collapsed completely. It certainly hasn't collapsed in Israel, okay? But we are living through an historical moment of order contestation, where more and more what we thought were sort of settled political issues, settled in the sense that sort of liberalism had won, we are discovering that is no longer the case, and we see more and more contestation and pushback against that. Let me try to sort of unpack that a tiny bit, and then we get to specifically to Israel, and then we open it up to discussion. Ron, it's going to be before my deadline. Okay, so if I have to sort of simplify this and to sort of kind of try to tease out what are the real differences between liberal politics and illiberal, and in some cases anti-liberal politics. They're not exactly the same thing, but for the sake of argument, we'll just put them in the same category at the moment. I would say the following things. Liberal politics, first and foremost, begins with the premise that the basic unit of society is the free and autonomous and responsible individual. That we are all endowed with inalienable right, that we are all created in the image of God. We have these rights that cannot be intruded upon by the state or by a tyrannous majority, right? By the tyranny of the majority. But basically, that it's the individual, the free and autonomous individual, that's the basis for a healthy society, for a good society. Illiberal or anti-liberal politics sees it very, very differently. And it essentially views the collective or the tribe as the essential unit of political organization. Now, the tribe can be defined in different ways. Sometimes it's a gender-based tribe. It could be gender, it could be class, it could be religion, it could be race, it could be ethnicity, right? So in different places, people's sense of collectivity is different. But the basic premise is the same. Illiberal politics also tends to think about this as that basically also means that society is not equal. It's hierarchical. There are superior groups and there are inferior groups. There are oppressors and oppressed, right? And that's a very different view of politics. Liberals believe in the possibility, not the inevitability, but the possibility of win-win politics, that we can have cooperative arrangements where we all gain. We might not all gain equally, but we can all gain. Okay? That will always be imperfect, but we are part of the same shared political order, and we can generate win-win games. We can make everybody's lives better. Illiberal or anti-liberal politics rejects that completely, right? It's a view of politics that is sort of politics as war. It's us versus them. It's the pure good people versus the corrupt elites, right? Sort of illiberal politics would say pretending otherwise is just a facade, right? Or worse, it's a conspiracy by liberal elites to ensure their own dominance over everybody else. Okay? A liberal view of politics, as John Locke most famously taught us, necessitates limited government and checks and balances. In order to have a healthy polity, power has to be constrained. You can't have unaccountable power. You have to have power that is constrained. Illiberal or anti-liberal politics thinks that these constraints are just a waste of time. Just give me the power, let me govern, and I will rule, right? That's the message. Lastly, moving to the international system, liberals believe in a state-based, rules-based international order, and they also believe that regime type really matters. That living in a world that is composed of lots of democracies is fundamentally different and better than living in a world of authoritarian regimes, right? That we're better off in a world that's composed of a lot of Denmarks than a world composed of a lot of North Koreas, right? So regime type really matters. Illiberal or anti-liberal, and that's why liberals are also so upset about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because it's not just about the war in Ukraine, it's about undoing of the entire liberal international order, the rules-based international order. Illiberal or anti-liberal politics, rules don't matter, might makes right. Whoever has power dominates the international system. There's no real commitment to the Westphalian principles. If Russia is powerful enough to create an empire, then that's kind of like, that's just the way it is. And regime type, again, doesn't really matter. What matters is power, okay? Okay, I'm going to end by putting before you sort of 3 provocations. So we have a kind of an inroad into our discussion about Israel, okay? So I want to make 3 points. Modern Israel was born into this liberal package. It was born into the liberal international order, both domestic and international. Israel never completely sat comfortably within the liberal international order. There were always issues that Israel was less comfortable with. But on the whole, if we go back to 75 years of Israeli independence, and we just marked 75 years of Israeli independence several months ago, it is absolutely astonishing how Israel not only survived but thrived within this liberal international order. In fact, if you look around the world, it's very difficult to identify another state, perhaps with the exception of South Korea, that did as well as Israel did from the liberal international order of the post-Second World War era. Okay, and I can explain why that is, if you want. Okay? Now this makes the current crisis in Israel really puzzling. It's a real enigma. A lot of Israelis are saying, what, I'm not going to use the expletive, what the hell is going on here? A country with a GDP per capita today of nearly $57,000, the fourth happiest country in the world on the World Happiness Index, a member of the OECD, a country with one of the longest life expectancies in the world. I mean, Israel is just, if you look at every international measure of human well-being, Israel is thriving. It's doing brilliantly. And a lot of Israelis are saying, so why wreck a winning formula? Why destroy something that has provided us with so much military, technological, economic, social benefits? Why destroy this thing? Okay, so it's a real puzzle. Okay, Dostoevsky has very interesting things to say about that. But we'll leave that for discussion. Okay, so big puzzle. Okay, so I already mentioned this idea of liberal unraveling. I want to say that in Israel, what I see is the decoupling of democracy and the rule of law as the elements of Israeli democracy. Huge fight. If you want to understand the underlying reason, the real deep motivating factor for the clash between the pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi camps, it really has to do with this. It has to do with a very different interpretation of what democracy is. For some Israelis, you cannot have democracy without the rule of law and protection of individual and minority rights. And for other Israelis, that the insistence on human rights and the rule of law is a liberal Ashkenazi facade meant to dominate Israeli politics. So it's anti-democratic, right? So that's a big disagreement. Okay. We have a serious erosion of civic friendship in Israel. A country that used to be, that had, at least at the elite level, a very coherent, cohesive elite, is fragmenting into tribes that increasingly view each other as not rivals, but enemies, traitors. Again, we have echoes of that in the United States. But civic friendship is fracturing in Israel. By the way, I think irrevocably. I think that it will be very hard to put Humpty Dumpty together again after the events of the last 8 or 9 months in terms of civic friendship in Israel, okay? So that's going to be very, very important. Lastly, and again, this might come as a surprise for many people, people tend to think about Israel as a really strong state. I think that Israel has very profound vulnerabilities at the level of statehood. Israel suffers from what I call areas of limited statehood, where the state of Israel does not govern. It doesn't govern areas of the Negev desert or the Galilee. There are certain populations in Israel that are not subject to Israeli law. Big limitations of statehood. Last, like any democracy around the world, the Israeli liberal package is fraying because Israelis are anxious about the future. They're anxious about the environment. Israelis feel in their marrow the coming tsunami of AI and synthetic biology and all these great transformations that are happening around the world. And they feel that Israeli democracy doesn't deliver the security and the opportunities that it did 20 or 30 or 40 or even 50 years ago. Ironically, paradoxically, with all the success. So let's have a conversation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Awesome and well timed. Thank you. Great. So we've started collecting questions. It's not too late for you to scribble a question on a note card. Please scribble clearly. I'm a doctor, but I'm not that kind of a doctor. I can't actually decipher. Right. So I'll start with a mix of my questions and questions that have come from the audience. Amichai, that was very clear and I thought very illuminating. Let me see, where should I start? I guess the first question that popped into my head was, if I may, an unfair question. A question from one political scientist to the next. You described the unraveling of this liberal order in Israel. You didn't entirely explain it. And I guess my explaining question is, okay, so all this is happening, and you described it very well, and you analyzed the unraveling. Oh, thank God you took your jacket off. Great. Fantastic. Thank you. You described the unraveling. I will do the same. Why now?
Well, that's the trillion shekel question, right? Why now? And gosh, we can spend a lot of time on that. Let's start with a distinction that we make when we try to analyze these types of ruptures, when we try to analyze revolutions or insurgencies or the onset of civil wars. We make a distinction between structure and contingency, okay? And I think, let me just say something about structure and let me say something about contingency. About structure, I want to say three things, very briefly. One is scaling up. Sometime in February or March 2024, Israel will cross the 10 million person threshold. Now that doesn't sound like a lot to Americans, and if you come from China, there are minor towns with 17 million people, right? But I grew up in an Israel of 3 million people. And by the way, Israel is the only country in the OECD, in the advanced club of Western, not just Western, but post-industrial democracies, that is growing as a result of birth rates and not as a result of immigration. We're the only one. Israelis have a ton of kids, right? Lots of kids. The Israeli population basically doubles every 25 years, okay? So by 2048, we're gonna be somewhere between 17 and 18 million people in Israel. It's pretty amazing, okay? If you want to break down of the demography, I'll tell you, ultra-Orthodox, Israeli Arab, secular, I can get into that. But the point is scale. It's happening now because as a country scales up from a country of 2 or 3 million people to a country of 10, 12, 15, 18 people, you cannot maintain the same elite coherence that you had when you were sort of a small, beleaguered, tiny country. So I think there's a scaling up issue, which, by the way, as you know, as a political theorist, Ron, is something that Plato thought about a lot, right? Plato thought that the ideal size for a republic was, does anybody know how many people would be citizens in a republic, according to Plato? 5,555. Nobody understands why. But the point is, and the founding fathers of the United States thought about this a lot, how do you build a functioning democracy once you cross the threshold of 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, 15 million people, okay? And Israel is sort of scaling up very, very rapidly. So I think there's an issue of elite coherence here, okay? So that's point number one. Related to that, point number two, demography. The nature of the Israeli population is changing very, very quickly. Just to kind of capture this very succinctly, when I was growing up as a child and sort of teenager in Israel, there was a majority Israeli culture and a whole bunch of small minority cultures. Yeah, so there was a majority Labor Zionist, Ashkenazi-dominated elite that primarily came from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, sometimes a little bit from Germany and Austria as well. By the time I was sort of growing up, that elite began to open up a little bit to become more inclusive of Sephardim. The status of women improved, but the elite was still fairly homogeneous. That is no longer the case in Israel. The religious are having many more children than the secular, and we are very rapidly moving from a society that was composed of a sort of a majority culture and a whole bunch of minorities to a country of what our former president Ruvi Rivlin famously called the 4 tribes. Israel is becoming a country of 4 tribes, right? The old kind of Ashkenazi elite, 1, the ultra-Orthodox 2, the nationalist religious 4, and Israeli Arabs, no, that's 3 and then 4, right? And Israeli Arabs 4. And if you look at the demography, secular liberal Israelis are looking at the big differences in birth rates, and they're freaked out. And especially they look at the birth rate of the ultra-Orthodox, and they say, unless we entrench liberal democratic rules of the game now, it will be impossible in 15 or 20 or 25 years' time, because the ultra-Orthodox are having so many more children that Israel will become a halachic state. It will become a religious state. So there is that. Finally, very briefly, why now? I think that Israel is going through like an identity crisis, a little bit like a teenager, okay? Remember, the United States had its civil war in its 85th year, right? Somebody can calculate it, right? 1776 in the Civil War, right? So it's an eighth decade. I don't think that's a coincidence. And there's a lot of literature that looks at what happens to corporations and countries in the 3rd generation, at the end of the 3rd generation of existence, right? It makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Because the first generation, they're the idealists, they're the revolutionaries, they're the people of ideas. It's the Ben-Gurion and the Jabotinskis, you know, they sort of lay the foundations for the state, etc. So that's first generation. Second generation is very busy implementing the vision into institutions. So they do all the institutional stuff, you know, building the ministries and the Knesset and establishing the laws, etc. The third generation then inherits something that has already been shaped, and they sort of scale it up and they manage it. And then what? Right? I don't think it's a coincidence that families have crises after the 3rd generation, corporations have crises after the 3rd generation, and countries have a crisis after the 3rd generation. I don't think it's a coincidence. So Israel, in many respects, is undergoing that crisis now for those complicated reasons. And I didn't even mention the name Netanyahu once, right?
Right, so that brings me to my next I'm collating questions together because the pile here is growing, but I'm sort of trying to sort them and paraphrase them. So several wise people in our audience have offered some counter arguments, or at least sort of parallel explanations. I wonder what you think about those. So one of those is, maybe the problem is that Israel never had a constitution. Explanation number 1. Explanation number 2, I mean, I'll remember what my different explanations were. Yes, that this has to do with inequality.
Let me take a note.
Yes, by all means, take notes. Explanation number 2 is that Israel was never really truly liberal and can't be liberal because of growing inequality between people. And explanation number 3 is the villain theory, that there's one man who's to blame for this. You might call it the Trump theory. We're gonna put it all. We're gonna put it all on that one rooster that we're gonna swing over our head. Right? There's this one victim who's gonna purge us of our sins, and we're gonna blame him for it. So, what do you think about those 3 explanations?
Yeah. So I think they all play a role, each and every one of them, but they kind of fit within a sort of a broader, deeper story. Okay, so I don't see those proposals as being necessarily in contradiction to what I've laid out, and let me explain why. No constitution. So it's true, Israel does not have a fully codified constitution, but like New Zealand or the United Kingdom, not all democracies do, right? Not all democracies have fully codified constitutions. New Zealand doesn't have one. The United Kingdom famously doesn't have one. By the way, North Korea has a beautiful constitution. Every right that you can possibly imagine is there. Okay, so a piece of paper called a constitution is no guarantee of constitutionalism, and not having a fully codified constitution is no guarantee for democratic failure. Point number one about constitution. Point number two, it is absolutely true, and this really goes to the heart of the current crisis, that as democracies go and as constitutional systems go, Israel has surprisingly few formal institutional checks and balances. There's no federalism in Israel, no two legislative houses where one can check the other. We have one Knesset. There's no presidential veto power over legislation. There are no local constituencies in Israel. It's all one list, a national list, right? So all these checks that exist in other places do not exist in Israel. So you might ask yourself, how did Israel function, as a vibrant democracy for 75 years? And the answer lies in what Montesquieu and later on Alexis de Tocqueville and others famously called mores, or norms. Remember, I'm going back to the point about a cohesive elite. In British politics, the English like to say there are certain things that are done and not done in politics, right? Winston Churchill used to say, it's not done, right? Certain things are sort of not done in politics. And for many decades in Israel, there was this civic friendship that prevented things that were not supposed to be done from not being done, like appointing Aryeh Deri type of character as a minister to the government. It was just not done. Remember, in 1972, Yitzhak Rabin, as prime minister, resigned because it was discovered that his wife Leah had a bank account in the United States with $230 in it that she opened when he was Israeli ambassador to Washington, and she forgot to close when they went back to Israel. And at that time, there were all these restrictions on foreign currency in Israel. The prime minister had to resign because his wife had an illegal bank account. That was it, okay? Look how far we've come, right? So what has deteriorated in Israel is not a collapse of some kind of constitution. It's that the norms of what is done and not done in politics, the norms of civic friendship and responsibility have grossly deteriorated in Israel, especially over the last 30 years, okay? So that's with regards to a constitution. Inequality. I'm gonna shock you a little bit, okay? I think in many respects, Israel in 2023 is more democratic than it was in 1993 or 1983 or 1973, or certainly 1963 or 1953, in the sense that many more voices participate in political contestation in Israel. If you look at women's rights, if you look at gay and lesbian rights in Israel, they've been transformed. If you look at the status of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews in terms of who sits on the Supreme Court or who becomes, the CEO of sort of a major company, Israel's become a much more equal kind of society in that respect. Paradoxically, greater pluralism and greater societal diversity has not produced greater coherence. It's produced greater argumentation and polarization, right? So Israel, in some respects, is more democratic, but it's less liberal. Yeah. Now, there's this huge debate going on about populism and why do we see this phenomena around the world, and it basically divides into those people who say it's all about inequality. It's all about this is the sort of the Piketty kind of logic argument. This idea that we've entered a new era of inequality, and that is what's driving anger, etc. I think making that case from a purely material economic point of view in Israel is very, very, very difficult. just as it's very difficult to make that argument in Poland and Hungary, simply because GDP per capita in Israel has, the quality of life for ordinary Israelis has become vastly better over the last, over exactly the same period of time as the quality of Israeli democracy has been going down, right? It's this paradox. So I think it's very difficult to, just to put this in perspective, and one of the reasons why Netanyahu has remained in power for so long is that when Netanyahu became prime minister for the second time in May 2009, does anybody know? Yaniv will know. What was the GDP per capita of Israel in May 2009? About $27,000 in today's terms. Today it's $56,000. So this very short period of time has been a spectacular economic success for Israel. Now, it's true that young people find it very difficult to buy apartments, etc. But I don't think that what's going on in Israel has to do with real estate prices. I think that it's much deeper. And I think it really has to do with questions of identity and anxiety that we don't yet sort of fully understand. Bibi Netanyahu. You have 2.5 hours? My God. Ay, ay, ay. Where do we start? With BB King. Where do we start? Okay. Gosh. Okay. So I'm going to resist some temptations, and I'll sort of zoom back and kind of think about this more in terms of the role of a leader in politics. And I'll say a couple of things. One, Benjamin Netanyahu is by far the most talented politician of his generation. Part of why Bibi is such a Shakespearean tragedy is because he's so supremely talented and yet pursued by ghosts that he can't escape from. But nobody understands Israeli politics and coalition formation and maintenance better than Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's why he's so tenacious and he's so pivotal to Israeli politics. Point number one. Point number two, and again, this might come as a surprise to some people, I really think that Bibi doesn't want the current coalition that he has. He doesn't want it. He didn't want it to begin with, but he got stuck with it simply because he feels that he absolutely has to hold on to power so that he can extricate himself from his legal problems. And he's, how shall I put this politely? He has told so many inaccuracies to so many of his natural political partners for so long that his political game sets, the people who are prepared to sit with him in government, that group has shrunk more and more, and he's been left with having to legitimize people that even 2 or 3 years ago he never would have been seen alive with on the same stage. I mean, literally, this time last year, Itamar Ben-Gvir wanted pictures, right? Well, he wanted pictures with the prime minister, with Netanyahu, on the same stage, and Bibi would say, no, I'm not taking a photo with this guy. But he was compelled, under his rationale, to form this coalition with people that even a year or 2 or 3 ago he never would have gotten into bed with, and that's because he feels that he doesn't have a choice. So that's kind of where we are. I think that could change very, very quickly. For example, if we have a real breakthrough with the Saudi peace deal, it's clear that the existing Israeli coalition government will not be able to do what the Biden administration or Mohammed bin Salman will demand that Israel will do vis-a-vis the Palestinians in order to have a peace deal. And therefore, Netanyahu knows that. Smotrich knows that. Ben-Gvir knows that. Yair Lapid knows that. Benny Gantz knows that. They all know that. And so the big, big political question if this deal does materialize, and we will know over the next 3 or 4 or 5 months because of the American elections. There's an action-forcing event. Bibi will have to try to form a different coalition, and it's going to be fascinating to see which way that's going to go, and whether Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid will rescue Benjamin Netanyahu. Perhaps we will live in 6 months' time in a world in which Saudi Arabia rescued Israeli democracy.
Several of the questions that came from the audience are interrogating my question to you about why now, and are counter-arguing that it didn't happen now, that it's been in the works for decades. One of our audience members reminds us of the Rabin assassination. They may have reminded us on, Begin storming the Knesset or the Altalena incident. But you've also seen me write about sort of unresolved tensions in Israeli society that have been around for 30, 40 years between secular and religious, between rich and poor, between Ashkenazi and other, between center and periphery, between Jews and non-Jews. All issues that have sort of lingered in uncertainty and have not been addressed. So that this unraveling is not a recent event, but the result of a decade-long process. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Whenever you try to analyze an historical event, you run into the problem of when did it begin, right? When did the French Revolution begin? When did the American Revolution begin? When did the Bolshevik Revolution begin? When did the dysfunction of American democracy begin? Did it begin with Donald Trump, or was Donald Trump a political entrepreneur who took advantage of an already brewing crisis, right? So there's that question always exists when we try to understand complex political phenomena. We can certainly identify antecedents to the current crisis. And you mentioned the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Some people mention the disengagement from Gaza and the forceful removal of communities from Gush Katif, and the fact that the nationalist religious population in Israel was incredibly angry with the Israeli Supreme Court for not defending their rights when their homes and cemeteries were being destroyed, right? So maybe 2023 is revenge for 2005, 2006, right? So there are all these narratives going on, and some people go back to the original sin of Ben-Gurion, giving exemption from military service to the ultra-Orthodox and allowing for the creation of separate educational systems in Israel. So we could look at a lot of fractures, but again, I don't think it resolves the puzzle, right? Because political theory tells us that as a country becomes richer and more pluralistic and more individualistic, it should kind of cohere, and it should sort of it's kind of like liberalism is supposed to be a mechanism for living with diversity, and yet we're discovering that it's not so simple, and that things are falling apart now. Why didn't Israel fall apart after the 73 war, right? When there was this profound crisis of confidence in the national leadership. Why didn't Israel fall apart in the Second Intifada? Yeah. I fundamentally go back to this issue of civic friendship, and I think that's what's different now. I think that for the very first time, Jewish Israelis, and I'm putting the Arab Israelis aside for the moment, because this is primarily a fight within the Jewish family, right? It's a struggle within the Jewish population in Israel. Tragically, more and more Israelis have stopped seeing their fellow Israelis as sort of fellow citizens, and are increasingly looking at them with suspicion and anger. I don't know how many of you have followed the news about what happened on Yom Kippur in Tel Aviv, when a group of religious people tried to set up a mechitza in Dizengoff Square, and there were squabbles, physical squabbles on Yom Kippur, unthinkable, right? So that's the shift. That's the change. And again, and I'll stop there. There's a silver lining to this crisis. In every crisis, there's a silver lining. David Ben-Gurion used to famously say, you can't resolve a small crisis. You need a big crisis to get a solution, right? The silver lining is that more and more Israelis, including the ultra-Orthodox, understand that the current social contract, in which a diminishing proportion of the population works in high tech, pays taxes, serves in the army, and funds everybody else, that formula is unsustainable. And that as the ultra-Orthodox, who are now 11 to 12% of the population, but by 2065 are going to be about 30 to 33% of the population, as their share in the population gets bigger, they're going to have to step up. And they're going to have to start seeing Israel as their country, a country that they have a responsibility to maintain in the way that wasn't the case when they were 2 or 3 or 4% of the population, right? And so the hopeful scenario, and in Israel, they're again, I'm quoting Ben-Gurion a lot today, but Ben-Gurion used to famously say, in Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. The hopeful miracle is that we're going to see a kind of renegotiation of the Israeli social contract in response to what's going on now, a little bit in the way that we saw happening after the Yom Kippur War. Where there was a profound crisis that led to a transition and a deep transformation of Israeli society, which I could talk about much more, but I won't. I know that we have lots of other things to talk about.
We do, and about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the penultimate question, because I think everybody can guess what the last question is going to be. So I'll ask the penultimate question. If we're looking for parallelisms to try to understand what's happening in Israel, what country in the world do you suggest we look at to sort of better understand causes and consequences and effects and impacts? Is there a country or a pair of countries, you've mentioned many,
Yeah.
that comes to mind that you would sort of lean on time and time again for inspiration?
For inspiration or for
For understanding. Thank you.
For inspiration, I go back to the Scandinavians, guys.
Yes.
You know, like I want to be the Norway, Denmark. It used to be Sweden, but Sweden now is in deep trouble. But I want to be the Denmark or Norway of the Middle East. Switzerland will also be okay, or New Zealand. You know, I can live with that. So that's the inspiration. There are several countries that I think provide us with really interesting parallels. One of them is the United States. And as you know, Israelis always look to the United States, and there's an argument that would say that the current Netanyahu phenomena is not completely divorced from the Trump phenomena. So that would be one direction. The other, might sound surprising to you, is Turkey. If you want to understand Israel, Turkey always provides a really fascinating mirror. It's not echad le'echad, as we say, it's not one for one, but Turkey's struggle between religiosity and secularism, between modernity and tradition, between liberalism and competing identities, many really interesting parallels between Turkey and Israel.
What about the notion that what's going on in Israel right now, and this is, I get this from two members of the audience, should not be thought of as a crisis and should not be thought of as an attack on liberalism from forces that wish ill, but rather should be thought of as a healthy corrective. That there are things in Israel that were askew, that were unfair, that were illegitimate. For example, the functioning of the courts and the way they're set up, the allocation of resources across ethnic groups, etc. And certainly, while the moves of the Netanyahu administration are extreme and unacceptable, perhaps, Maybe they have a point somewhere.
No, they don't. No, and I say this as somebody who grew up in the revisionist movement, who once had my cheek stroked by Menachem Begin. I grew up within the old Likud of Dan Meridor and of Tzipi Livni and other people, and I think that if Zev Jabotinsky or Menachem Begin would have seen what has become of Likud today, they would have been aghast. Let me explain. I go back to my point about Israel having very few formal checks and balances. Remember that point? Okay. So I'll flesh this out a little bit. Fundamentally, so point number one: be very, very, very careful comparing American constitutional Israel or any other country to any other country. This is one of the key insights of Edmund Burke we haven't mentioned today. That every political system is like a garden. It's like an English garden, right? It's its own delicate ecology. And if you're going to make changes, particularly to a country that is doing so damn well, you better do it very, very slowly, very incrementally. And you better remember the law of unintended consequences, right? So if you're a conservative, even if you come at this from a conservative, and I guess whoever wrote this question defines themselves as a conservative, perhaps, מי כתב את השאלה הזאת? Okay, but you raised the question. Okay, fine. I knew, I could see the little smile, I could see. I'm on to you. So even if you want to make these kinds of changes, if a system is performing extremely well, you want to do it gradually, and most importantly, you want to do it by consensus. Or you want to do it with broad agreement. Okay, I'm getting a little bit Talmudic here, but let me try to focus this. The only check on executive power in Israel is the Israeli legal establishment. And I call it the Israeli legal establishment because it's not only the Supreme Court, but it's also the position of the Attorney General, which is extremely powerful in Israel. Now, do I have a lot of criticism of the Israeli legal establishment? Absolutely, I do. Do I think that there are areas that require profound reform? Yes, I do. And we can talk about justiciability and reasonableness and standing and diversity of appointments and all of that. We can have that conversation. We have to have the conversation, and that's fine. But that does not translate into an iota of what Yariv Levin, with the backing of Netanyahu, is currently trying to do to the Israeli system. And I have a doctorate in law. I worked for the Attorney General in Israel. I had 2 stints in the Israeli army, once as a paratrooper and another in the JAG, the Judge Advocate General. So I sort of know the Israeli system fairly well. Yes, there are things to be corrected with the legal system. No, there's absolutely no justification for trying to politicize the Israeli judiciary, destroy the independence of the judiciary, and weaken the position of the Attorney General. The implications would be catastrophic in terms of permitting public corruption in Israel, but also in exposing Israeli soldiers and commanders and politicians to international criminal investigations. The only thing standing between Israel and the International Criminal Court right now is the independence of the Israeli judiciary and the very high reputation that the Israeli Supreme Court has internationally. Once that is eroded or destroyed, we are in very, very dangerous territory. And I don't want to get into sort of talking about the personality of Netanyahu, etc. but I think this is really, really important. We can debate policy. For me as an Israeli, I will not compromise on the nature of my polity. Winning an election and having 64 seats in the Knesset is a mandate to govern within the democratic rules of the game. It is not a license to destroy liberal democracy in Israel. And we have to be very, very clear about that. Okay?
Last question, 6 minutes or less. As my Soviet friends would have said, what is to be done?
By whom and to whom?
Exactly, by whom and to whom. So that's the question.
Yeah.
So maybe you could answer that question in all sorts of ways. Maybe you want to focus it on this beautiful notion of civic friendship that you mentioned. So what's the opposite of unraveling? I guess weaving together. How do you weave this together? How do you undo this? And do you have any realistic suggestions that are not pie in the sky?
Yeah, so the first thing that needs to be done is to continue the astonishing voice of so many Israelis who go out week after week for over 40 weeks now. This is the equivalent of so somewhere between 3.5% and 5% of the entire Israeli population goes out with the flag and with their children. Not a window broken, nobody got killed, no riots, no looting. People go out to the street to protect the rule of law and liberal democracy in Israel. This would be the equivalent of 18 million Americans marching peacefully for liberal democracy in the United States week after week after week after week. It's astonishing. It's an amazing thing. So the first thing to be done, that needs to continue. That civic protest movement. We didn't mention Hannah Arendt today. We can't finish this without mentioning Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt famously said in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, when push comes to shove, it's not going to be a constitution, it's not going to be legislative rules or procedures that are going to save a democracy from collapsing. It's going to be an informed and mobilized and courageous citizenry. And what we are seeing in Israel right now is a supreme exercise of civic responsibility. It's Israelis saying, lo ikre, lo yavo, thou shalt not pass. This will not pass. And that's an amazing thing. And it needs to be recognized and it needs to be celebrated. By the way, it is recognized. I get emails from colleagues from Turkey, from Poland, from Hungary saying, good on you. We wish we did what you are doing now when Orban or Erdogan started taking us down a slippery slope to authoritarianism. So that's the first thing. And that protest movement has already had tremendous success, but it's not enough. So the first thing to do is to use every legal means to signal to Netanyahu, stop. At the end of the day, you cannot put your personal needs before the fundamental national interest of the state of Israel. That is not to be done, and shame on you for trying to do it. That's a very, very important message to be sent. Then, as I mentioned, we could have a very, you see, the beautiful thing about Israeli democracy, some people see this as a weakness, but it's actually a great strength of parliamentary democracy and not presidential democracy, is that Netanyahu only has a mandate to govern as long as he has a coalition with a majority of one. And he's 3 members of Knesset away from losing that majority. And as we know, Likud has split in the past over the Gaza disengagement. Israeli politics is very fluid. Things can change very, very quickly. And again, I go back to my earlier point. When he goes to sleep at night next to Sarah, we think, Bibi is saying to myself, please God rescue me from this coalition. And he wants a different coalition. So things can change very, very quickly. In the longer term, Israelis are having an amazing discussion. People are writing book called The Third Israeli Republic, Israeli Social Contract 2.0, 3.0, right? Yeah. I mean, there's a very, very rich conversation happening in Israel today about how do we come together. And if you look at public opinion polls, what most Israelis want is achdut. They want arvut adadit. They want a togetherness because they love the country and they're very proud of it. So I think we're going to get out of it relatively quickly. And then we need to have a very serious conversation about setting constitutional rules of the game so that we don't fall into this kind of crisis again. We could see some kind of constitutional convention in Israel. More realistically, we could see all sorts of incremental proposals, basic laws, amendments to basic laws that will be quite dry, but will try to set guardrails and introduce more formal guarantees to protect the miracle that is Israeli democracy.
Thank you, Amichai. On the dot, this is not our Institute's first talk on the current crisis in Israel. This is not our last talk. This is in fact part of a series of, I want to say, 6, 7, 8 talks, some of which are in person, some of which are online, some of which are open to the public. You can find 9, Rebecca says. You can find recordings of prior talks, recordings of future talks, and information on all these talks on our website. Just Google Berkeley Israel Institute and you'll get there. I thank you all for coming. I thank those of you who support our institute by coming. I thank those of you who support our institute by supporting our institute in all sorts of different ways. And I hope to see you in one of our future events. Please join me in thanking Amichai one more time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking Rebecca and Ron for the incredible work that they're doing here at UC Berkeley. Thank you.